I've always prided myself on being the kind of wife who actually cares. When I met David in college, he was this sweet, slightly disorganized guy who clearly needed someone to help him get his life together. I was pre-med then, before I switched to marketing, and I had this natural instinct to fix things, to make them better. David was brilliant but scattered, the type who'd forget to eat lunch because he was so absorbed in his engineering projects. I started bringing him sandwiches during study sessions, organizing his schedule, helping him stay on track. Everyone said we were perfect together. And honestly, we were 4 years of marriage, and I'd built us this amazing life. We bought our house 2 years ago, this beautiful colonial that I spent months finding, negotiating the price down by $15,000 because I actually read the inspection report and caught things the seller hoped we'd miss. David just wanted to accept the first decent place we saw, but that's exactly why he needed me. I handled the mortgage paperwork, set up all our utilities, even picked out most of the furniture because his idea of decorating was putting up a single movie poster and calling it done. Our home was magazine-worthy because I made it that way. I kept our social calendar, remembered his mother's birthday, made sure he went to the dentist twice a year, like an actual adult. When his work shirt started looking dingy, I researched the best stain removal techniques and bought him new ones before he even noticed. I planned our vacations, managed our budget, and somehow still worked full-time at the marketing firm. David would always say he was lucky to have me, and he was right, but I never made him feel bad about it. I just quietly took care of everything, because that's what good wives do. So when I had to have emergency gallbladder surgery 3 months ago, I expected him to step up the way I'd always stepped up for him. And at first, he did. He took time off work, slept in the hospital chair, brought me decent food when I complained about the hospital meals. The surgery was supposed to be routine, but I had complications. An infection that meant I'd need 6 weeks of recovery instead of 2. 6 weeks of being basically bedridden, needing help with everything. David seemed overwhelmed by the whole situation, which I understood, but it was frustrating watching him fumble through tasks I could normally handle in my sleep. That's when my mother suggested Sabrina come help out. My sister had just finished some freelance marketing project and had time between jobs, and Mom thought it would be good for us to spend time together. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Sabrina had always been the family golden child, 3 years younger than me, but somehow always the center of attention. She was the one who got to be carefree and spontaneous, while I was responsible and reliable. But I was in genuine pain, barely able to get to the bathroom by myself, and David was clearly struggling to manage both work and taking care of me. Sabrina moved into our guest room after my first week of recovery, and I have to admit, she was helpful at first. She cooked meals that were actually edible, kept the house clean, ran errands without being asked. She had this easy way of chatting with David that I envied sometimes. I was usually so focused on managing our life that I forgot we could just talk about random stuff. From my bed, I'd hear them laughing in the kitchen while she made dinner. And there was this weird feeling in my stomach that wasn't just from the surgery. By the second week, I started noticing things. David would come upstairs to check on me, but his mind seemed elsewhere. He'd ask how I was feeling, but I could tell he wasn't really listening to my answer. When I complained about being bored or in pain, he'd nod sympathetically, but then find an excuse to go back downstairs where Sabrina was. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the pain medication was making me emotional, but the feeling kept growing. Sabrina started doing things that felt like she was playing house with my husband. She'd have coffee ready for him in the morning before he left for work, using the expensive beans I'd bought that he'd never bothered to make for himself. She reorganized our kitchen, claiming she was just trying to be helpful. But suddenly David knew where everything was because she'd shown him. She bought groceries without asking what I wanted, just picking things she thought we'd like. When I mentioned that I preferred a different brand of something, she'd smile and say she'd remember for next time. But she never did. The worst part was how comfortable they became with each other. I'd call downstairs asking for water or another pillow, and they'd be so engrossed in their conversation that David would forget to bring it up for an hour. When I finally got frustrated and mentioned it, he'd apologize, but in that distracted way that meant he wasn't really sorry, just annoyed at being interrupted. Sabrina would appear behind him with this concerned expression, asking if there was anything she could do, and I'd feel like the demanding invalid disrupting their perfect little domestic routine. During my 3rd week of recovery, things got worse. David started working longer hours, claiming he needed to make up for the time he'd taken off, which meant Sabrina and I were alone in the house most of the day. She'd bring me meals and updates on what she was doing. Laundry, cleaning, organizing the garage that I'd been asking David to tackle for months. She'd sit on the edge of my bed and chat about her job search, her dating life, how much she enjoyed spending time with David because he was so different from the guys she usually met. That comment stuck with me. Different how I wanted to ask, but something held me back. I started paying closer attention to their interactions when David got home from work. Sabrina would light up when she heard his car in the driveway, rushing to greet him at the door like an excited puppy. She'd have dinner ready and would insist on hearing about his day while they ate together downstairs. I was still eating most of my meals in bed because sitting at the table was uncomfortable. So I'd listen to their voices drifting up through the floor. Their conversations flowed so easily, punctuated by laughter that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. David started coming to bed later and later, claiming he was helping Sabrina clean up or watching a movie with her because she seemed lonely. When he finally did come upstairs, he'd slip into bed quietly, trying not to wake me, but I was usually already awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering why my husband was spending more time with my sister than with me when I tried to talk to him about it. He'd brush off my concerns, saying Sabrina was just being nice and I should be grateful for her help. By the 4th week, I was getting stronger physically, but feeling more isolated than ever. David and Sabrina had developed all these inside jokes and shared references from their days together. They'd start laughing about something, then notice me watching and try to explain, but it never felt funny when they repeated it. It was like they'd built this little bubble around themselves that I couldn't penetrate. I started timing how long David would stay in my room versus how long he'd spend downstairs with Sabrina, and the numbers were depressing. I began testing them, asking David to bring me things when I knew he was in the middle of conversations with Sabrina. He'd comply, but with increasing irritation, like I was being unreasonable for needing my husband's attention. Sabrina would hover in the doorway sometimes, watching him help me with this martyred expression, like she was witnessing some great sacrifice. I wanted to scream that he was my husband, that taking care of me wasn't some huge favor he was doing for a stranger. The breaking point came during my 5th week of recovery. I woke up around 2 a.m, needing pain medication, and David wasn't in bed. This had happened a few times before. He'd claimed he couldn't sleep and had gone to the couch to watch TV. But when I made my way downstairs, moving carefully in the dark, I saw them together in the living room. They weren't doing anything obviously inappropriate, just sitting closer than siblings-in-law should sit, talking in low voices with an intimacy that made my chest tight. David's hand was on Sabrina's knee, and she was leaning into him like they were lovers sharing secrets. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching my husband comfort my sister in ways he hadn't comforted me since before my surgery. When Sabrina started crying and about what I couldn't hear, David pulled her against his chest and stroked her hair. The tenderness in that gesture broke something inside me. This was how he used to hold me when I was upset, but I couldn't remember the last time he'd shown me that kind of gentle affection. I crept back upstairs without confronting them, my mind racing. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, analyzing every interaction I'd witnessed over the past month, and suddenly everything made horrible sense. The lingering looks, the shared laughter, the way they'd grown more comfortable with each other while David grew more distant from me. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, but also vindicated that my instincts had been right. The next morning, I watched them carefully. David was more attentive to me than he'd been in weeks, bringing me breakfast in bed and asking repeatedly how I was feeling. Sabrina was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact when she came to collect my dishes. Their guilt was practically radiating off them, and I felt this cold satisfaction at finally understanding what was really happening in my house. By the end of my 6th week of recovery, Sabrina was supposed to move back to her apartment. I was mobile enough to manage on my own, and she'd helped me transition back to normal activities. The day before she left, I caught David and Sabrina in what was obviously an emotional goodbye in the kitchen. They sprang apart when I walked in, both looking flustered and guilty. Sabrina stammered something about making sure I had everything I needed, and David busied himself with loading the dishwasher like it was the most important task in the world. After Sabrina left, I expected things to go back to normal, but David remained distant and distracted. He'd disappear for hours, claiming he was running errands or going to the gym. But he never had shopping bags or looked like he'd been working out. His phone, which had never been an issue before, suddenly became something he guarded carefully. He'd take it with him to the bathroom, flip it face down when I walked into the room, and angle the screen away from me when he was texting. I started paying attention to his patterns. He'd get texts that would make him smile in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months, then quickly hide his reaction. He'd volunteer to run errands that didn't need running, disappearing for 2 hours to buy milk. When I asked about his day, he'd give vague, forgettable answers that told me nothing about where he'd actually been or what he'd done. The man I'd been married to for 4 years had become a stranger keeping secrets. 2 weeks after Sabrina moved out, I found the proof I'd been unconsciously looking for. David left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered, and for the first time in months, it wasn't password protected. I told myself I was just checking the time, but when I saw Sabrina's name on the screen with a preview of her latest message, I couldn't stop myself from reading. The messages were devastating. Weeks of conversations that had clearly been going on throughout my recovery and continued after she left. They weren't explicitly sexual, but the emotional intimacy was unmistakable. David telling Sabrina how much he missed talking to her, how empty the house felt without her laughter. Sabrina responding that she missed him too, that she'd never connected with someone the way she connected with him. References to moments they'd shared while I was sleeping upstairs, inside jokes that had developed during those weeks when I thought she was just helping out. I took screenshots of everything, my hands shaking with rage and vindication. Here was proof that I hadn't been paranoid or jealous or crazy. My husband was having an emotional affair with my sister, and it had been going on right under my nose while I was recovering from surgery. The betrayal was breathtaking in its cruelty. But I also felt this twisted satisfaction at being right about my suspicions. Instead of confronting David immediately, I decided I needed more evidence. If I was going to blow up my marriage and my family, I wanted to be absolutely certain I had the full picture. I started documenting everything. The times David left the house, how long he was gone, his mood when he returned. I created a fake social media profile and found Sabrina's accounts, scrolling through weeks of posts for clues about where she'd been and when. The more I investigated, the angrier I became. Sabrina had been posting cryptic messages about finding happiness in unexpected places and connections that surprise you right around the time she'd been living in my house. She'd shared articles about following your heart even when it was complicated, accompanied by heart eye emojis that now seemed like taunts directed at me. Meanwhile, I'd been stuck in bed, grateful for her help, completely oblivious to the fact that she was stealing my husband's affections. I hired a private investigator, something that felt both dramatic and necessary. I needed an objective third party to document what was happening, because I knew that when I finally confronted them, they'd try to make me seem crazy and paranoid. The investigator was a middle-aged woman who specialized in infidelity cases, and she didn't seem surprised by anything I told her. She explained that affairs often develop in situations exactly like mine, when one spouse is vulnerable and a third party steps in to fill emotional needs. For 2 weeks, the investigator followed David and documented his activities. The photos she brought me were like physical blows. David meeting Sabrina at coffee shops, sitting in his car outside her apartment building, walking through parks with their heads bent together in intimate conversation. In every image, they looked like lovers, comfortable, connected, completely absorbed in each other. The investigator had even captured them, hugging goodbye after one of their meetings. A embrace that lasted longer than anything appropriate between a brother and sister-in-law. I also reached out to Sabrina's college roommate, someone I'd met a few times at family gatherings. Under the guise of planning a surprise for Sabrina, I asked about her dating history and relationship patterns. What I learned made my blood run cold. According to her roommate, Sabrina had a history of developing crushes on her friends' boyfriends and husbands. She'd never acted on it before, as far as the roommate knew. But she definitely had a pattern of inserting herself into other people's relationships and becoming inappropriately close to taken men. Armed with all this evidence, I finally decided to confront my family. I chose to start with my parents and Sabrina, wanting to hear her side before I dealt with David. I showed up at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon when I knew they'd all be there for their weekly family dinner, a tradition I'd been too busy to attend recently, though now I wondered if my absence had been convenient for Sabrina's narrative. My parents were surprised to see me, and Sabrina looked immediately uncomfortable when I walked into their living room. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out my phone and started showing them the screenshots of David and Sabrina's text conversations, explaining how I'd discovered their emotional affair and hired an investigator to document their continued relationship. Sabrina's face went white, then red, then white again. She started to deny everything, but I had too much evidence for her lies to hold up. Finally, she broke down and confessed, but her explanation was somehow worse than the affair itself. According to Sabrina, David had told her that our marriage had been over for years, that we were only staying together out of habit and convenience. She claimed he'd described me as frigid and unapproachable, someone who cared more about having a perfect house than having a real relationship. The words hit me like physical blows, but Sabrina wasn't finished. She said she'd developed feelings for David during those weeks in our house, watching him struggle to balance work and taking care of me. She painted herself as his emotional savior, someone who actually listened to him and appreciated him, unlike his cold, demanding wife. When I demanded to know how she could justify pursuing her sister's husband, she looked me straight in the eye and said she wouldn't apologize for finding happiness, even if it was complicated. My parents' reaction was the final betrayal. Instead of being horrified by Sabrina's behavior, they seemed more concerned about the family drama I was creating. My father accused me of violating David and Sabrina's privacy by reading their texts and hiring an investigator. My mother kept saying there must be some misunderstanding, that Sabrina would never intentionally hurt me. When I showed them the investigator's photos and group, they admitted the situation was inappropriate, but called it a mistake that could be forgiven with time and family counseling. I left my parents' house feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to support me unconditionally were making excuses for the woman who'd betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. I drove home in a rage, preparing for the confrontation with David that I knew would end our marriage. David was waiting for me when I got home, clearly having received a panicked phone call from Sabrina. He tried to control the narrative from the moment I walked in, explaining that Sabrina had manipulated and seduced him during a vulnerable time. He showed me texts where Sabrina had initiated most of their conversations, where she'd suggested their secret meetings, where she'd even threatened to tell me he'd seduced her if he tried to end their relationship. For a moment, I almost believed him. The David I'd married wasn't a cheater or a liar, and Sabrina did have a history of inappropriate behavior around taken men. But then I realized it didn't matter who had initiated what. David had made a choice every single day to continue the affair. He'd chosen to meet my sister in secret, to share intimate conversations with her, to give her the emotional connection that should have belonged to me. Whether he was the predator or the prey, he'd still betrayed our marriage vows and destroyed our family. I told David I wanted a divorce, and he moved into the guest room that night. For the next 2 weeks, he tried to apologize and explain, but I was done listening. I'd hired a lawyer and started divorce proceedings, focused on protecting my assets and getting out of the marriage with my dignity intact. David's work performance started suffering. His boss actually called me, concerned that David seemed distracted and upset. I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that his choices were finally having consequences. The private investigator continued documenting David and Sabrina's relationship, and what she found proved that David's victim narrative was complete bullshit. Photos of them looking happy and comfortable together, acting like a couple, exploring a new relationship. Whatever guilt or manipulation David claimed to feel wasn't stopping him from continuing to see my sister behind my back. I presented this final evidence to my parents, along with an ultimatum. They could have a relationship with me or with Sabrina, but not both. I wasn't going to pretend this was some minor family squabble that could be smoothed over with time. Sabrina had deliberately targeted my marriage, and my parents had chosen to enable her behavior instead of supporting their other daughter. My parents chose Sabrina just like they'd always chosen Sabrina. They said I was being unreasonable and vindictive, that families should stick together through difficult times. My father accused me of trying to manipulate them with ultimatums, and my mother cried about losing both her daughters over a mistake. I realized they'd never seen me as the victim in this situation. I was the troublemaker disrupting their perfect family dynamic. I changed my phone number and blocked all my family members on social media. When my mother tried to reach out through friends and extended family, I made it clear that I had no interest in reconciliation. I wasn't going to be guilted into accepting an apology that would never come, or pretending that what Sabrina did was forgivable for the sake of family peace. The divorce was finalized last week. I kept the house that I'd found and decorated and turned into a home. While David took most of our savings, he moved in with Sabrina at my parents' house, and according to my brother Isaac, who still talks to me, their relationship fell apart almost immediately. Apparently, the excitement of forbidden romance doesn't translate well to cramped living quarters and social disapproval. Sabrina lost her marketing job when word of the affair spread through her professional network. And now my parents are supporting 2 unemployed adults who can barely stand to be in the same room together. I've started dating someone new, Lucas, a teacher I met through a friend at work. He's kind and stable and doesn't come with any complicated family drama. When I told him about my divorce, he was sympathetic but not overly interested in the details. He's more focused on building something new with me than rehashing the failures of my past relationship. Sometimes I drive past my parents' house and see David's car in the driveway, and I feel this deep satisfaction knowing that he gave up everything for a fantasy that couldn't survive reality. Sabrina got exactly what she thought she wanted, my husband's attention and affection, but it turns out that a man who will cheat with you will eventually disappoint you too. They destroyed my marriage and fractured our family for a relationship that lasted less than 6 months as an actual couple. I don't regret any of the choices I made. I could have been the bigger person, could have tried to work things out or forgiven them for the sake of family harmony, but I refused to accept scraps of respect and loyalty from people who should have given me their whole hearts. David and Sabrina made their choices, and I made mine. I'm building a life with people who actually value me, while they're stuck living with the consequences of their betrayal. My extended family has mostly taken my side, horrified by Sabrina's behavior and my parents' enabling. My grandmother told my mother that she was ashamed of how she'd handled the situation, and several aunts and uncles have cut off contact with my parents entirely. The family fracture that my parents blamed me for creating was actually created by their refusal to hold Sabrina accountable for her actions. Looking back, I can see that my marriage to David probably had problems I didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe I was too focused on managing our life and not focused enough on connecting with him emotionally. Maybe the perfect wife persona I'd worked so hard to maintain had actually created distance between us. But none of that justifies what David and Sabrina did. And I'm not going to take responsibility for their choices to handle their feelings through deception and betrayal. I'm happier now than I've been in years. My house is peaceful. My relationship with Lucas is built on honesty and mutual respect. And I'm surrounded by people who proved their loyalty when it mattered most. David and Sabrina can have each other and whatever miserable life they've created together. I'm done caring about people who never really cared about me.